is $14.75 billion that's available to utilities to apply.
You stepped down as CEO for National Rural Water, but you're still staying engaged in the community, especially in some PFAS litigation. So
the purpose of filing the lawsuit was simply to decrease 94% of the population has detectable limits in their bloodstream. So this is 37.4 million pages of discovery.
How much of a proportion do you think that they could potentially receive? Is it so let's say they got to put in a $10 million PFAS elimination system.
Settlement was reached with DuPont for 1.18. A settlement was reached with 3M for 12.5. Tyco for 750 million.
And that was kind of next on the litigation agenda as well. Do you have any information to share? All right, everyone. Thanks for coming to the show today. I'm Mike Groselle, your host with Engineers for Communities. I've got Sam Wade here. He's the former CEO of the National Rural Water Association. Thanks for coming on today.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
So we were just recently chatting, and you kind of mentioned you stepped down as CEO for National Rural Water, but you're still staying engaged in the community, especially in some PFAS litigation. So I'd love to hear about kind of how you kept involved.
Oh, sure. Well, my background is it really started in a small community up in Minnesota, population 811. So that's my foundation, so to speak. And I worked for the Minnesota Rural Water Association when I left the utility in its younger years, and moved to National Rural Water in 1985 and served as the deputy CEO from 87 to 2013 when I became the CEO of the organization. And in 2018, National Rural Water Board of Directors, which is comprised of one member from each of the state rural water affiliates, like Colorado Rural Water, they voted to engage with the Napoli Law firm to file a lawsuit against the global manufacturers of PFAS, because they could see each one of those folks either operate, govern, or manage a water utility, so they could see the impending financial impact of PFAS on their ratepayers. So the purpose of filing the lawsuit was simply to create a vehicle for utilities to hopefully recover expenses associated with PFAS. So I decided after 36 years I should probably retire, which ended up being a semi-retirement, because the law firm asked if I'd be interested in working with them as a consultant to support that litigation. And it was a great opportunity for me to stay in touch with people that I've known for many years and stay in touch with the industry. And I think this lawsuit is so important to utilities in dealing with PFAS, because it can at least lessen the financial impact on the ratepayers.
And so just to bring people up to speed on PFAS, so they're these forever chemicals, mostly from different manufacturing facilities, discharge or produce it, and it gets into the environment. And then just to also bring people up to speed, the EPA is pushing down new policies of how these municipalities have to deal with it, and that's why it hit your radar so big. You're like, oh well, yes, they're going to get blindsided by this and have no money to deal with it.
Correct. Yeah. The PFAS, and frankly, prior to 2016, when EPA issued the non-enforceable health advisory, which lowered that advisory level from 400 parts per trillion down to 70 parts per trillion, I'd never heard of PFAS, and most people in the industry, just blindsided people. And I don't know if it was, the timing or whatever, but it got lots and lots of media attention and so forth. PFAS has been around since the 40s. It's used in firefighting, if you will, but it's also used in practically everything we come into contact with on a daily basis. Cosmetics, anything water resistant, stain resistant, particularly used in the AFFF foam as PFAS in fighting around airports, military bases where they have to practice, fire training academies and that type of thing. So it's literally called the everywhere chemical because that's really, really true. And it's the forever chemical because it doesn't break down in the environment. Primary sources of contamination of our water supply is certainly the use of AFFF foam, manufacturing, because it's used in manufacturing products, landfills, particularly older landfills not aligned to today's standards. And, I was talking to a utility early on. He said, there's nothing around us for 20 miles, nothing. And we have PFAS in our water supply. And the more we talked in earlier years, the fire department would spray AFFF foam on the tennis court for community days. And kids played in it. Nobody knew any difference. So it is literally everywhere. And then also the spreading of contaminated biosolids is a major thing as well. And those are the primary sources of contamination of our water supply. Studies show that I think it's 94% of the population has detectable limits in our bloodstream. So this is it's actually a worldwide problem. And EPA is regulating it. 4 parts per trillion is the MCL. And it's also a carcinogen. So, the MCL goal is 0.
Wow. Yeah. That story about the tennis courts with the kids, that's kind of crazy to just think about because,
yeah,
it's just like unleaded fuel. Like people just didn't know what
they
it was doing.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. So back to the litigation,
Mm-hmm.
and kind of how it ties into the wastewater systems, how they can benefit. So, how do they benefit from it, or how can they get involved?
Okay. Since I've been involved in this industry for many years, I've always heard the embracing of the idea that polluters should pay. And so as I've gotten engaged in this is truly polluter pays kind of effort for a couple of reasons. If you have PFAS in your water supply and you meet the requirements and so forth, you get money from these companies that manufacture the chemical. And that money comes directly to the utility. It doesn't go through a third party. There's no plans that have to be approved or, monthly reporting, that kind of thing. The money comes to the utility. So it's truly polluter pays. So this was started in 2018, and just one of the numbers that blows my mind away because, I don't think anyone can understand this process unless you're engaged in it. But there was 37.4 million pages of discovery in this litigation. So if you can imagine that, it started in 2018, and in 2023, a settlement was reached with 3M for $12.5 billion. And a settlement was reached with DuPont for 1.185 billion, and then more recently Tyco for 750 million and BASF for 316.5 billion. So that totals right now on the table is $14.75 billion that's available to utilities to apply for. And of course, every settlement is different and has different time frames and so forth. But basically, if you had tested and had PFAS in your water supply prior to June 22nd of 23, you're considered a phase 1 utility, and you apply for this funds. Now, the deadline to apply for that is July 26th, so it's not an awful lot of time.
It's a week from today.
Yeah, a week from today, and there also has to be a day or two of processing time in there. But there's also phase 2. If you test after July, after June 22nd of 23, you fall into phase 2 category, and you're eligible for those funds. and that's just 3M and DuPont. Tyco and BASF, you have to have tested prior to May 15th of 2024. Now, there's 12 other companies to settle, and we don't know what the requirements will be for those yet. But the phase 2 for the 3M is important because of the UCMR 5. Even though you have it tested, you'd still be eligible for that big pot of money.
So are these just so people who are eligible? Is it just water communities that serve water, wastewater? Is it stormwater dischargers? Like who all? When we say utilities, right? It's a bigger bucket.
Correct.
So
Yeah, this is strictly public water supplies.
public water.
It doesn't relieve these companies from any liability for wastewater, which is next on the litigation agenda, if you will. This is strictly public water supplies.
Okay. And so how hard is it to apply? Is it a one-page document? Is it just an email address and a name? I mean, I've seen all different forms when you talk about class action lawsuits and things like this nature.
Yeah. I wish it was that easy. It's not real complicated. And I'll just share with you the way it works. And we have quite a few systems in Colorado that are participating in this. The website, you can go in, do the preliminary information, and that's simply like 5 questions. That usually comes directly to me, and then I'll send out background information as well as a retainer that needs to be signed. But as far as documentation to file the claim, you certainly need lab results for each source, completed IRS W-9 form, which should be readily available. And the biggest thing is pumping records for the past 10 years or some documentation of the usage over the period of time, because the formula to determine the amount of the award is based on maximum daily flows, and they take the 3 highest years out of those 10 years, average it out to get the maximum daily flow and the level of PFAS in the water.
Okay. So it's a loading and a volume thing.
Right. And if the system's taken remedial action prior to June 22nd of 23, there's another set of category of funding that goes on top of that.
Like they could get reimbursed for those expenses?
Well, I wouldn't say reimbursement. They would get
Okay.
a substantial amount of money out of
Okay.
that. If they exceed the state MCL or the federal MCL, there's another pot of money that stacks on top of that. So this can end up being, depending on that particular situation, a substantial amount of money to lessen the financial burden to deal with it. So that's really all that's needed, along with any withdrawal permits. And there's various ways to get around some of that stuff if you don't have that information available. For example, I think you can use the pump rating, if you will, on per source if you have to. And then once that is sent in, there's a huge legal team of paralegals and attorneys that evaluate all that, determine eligibility and what phase you're in and all that kind of stuff. And they write up the complaint and they send it back to the system for concurrence. And then they file that into the claims process. And the claims process is to a claims administrator appointed by the court, completely independent of the litigation, if you will. So the law firm advocates to maximize the return to the utility, which are your clients.
Yeah. So does the I guess how, and I know this is kind of a vague question, so if you need more clarification, how much proportionally, their remediation and their cost to actually deal with it, how much of a proportion do you think that they could potentially receive? Is it so let's say they got to put in a $10 million PFAS elimination system into their drinking water plant. Are they going to get potentially half, or do you know where they're kind of landing on that spectrum, like those costs? Or
I I get asked that a lot. I
Okay.
really don't know. There is on the law firm's website. There's a calculator that can give a system an estimate because there's so many variables that go into it, the level of PFAS and the flow rates and so forth. And it gets a little bit complicated because it's any of those PFAS compounds. It's not just PFAS and PFOA.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So if they go to that website, there's a way for them to get a general idea to educate
Yes.
themselves so that they
Yes.
know. Okay.
Yeah. And it's www.napolilaw.com /NRWA -PFAS.
Yeah, and we'll put a link in the description as well.
Gotcha.
Okay. That's huge. I think that could, I mean, it sounds like that's really going to help move the needle because, I mean, the more I talk to, I go to stuff like Left Tech, Colorado Rural Water, and everyone's freaking out about how are we going to pay for this? It just seems to be coming out of nowhere. And so hopefully this is something that can help really bridge the gap for these
Absolutely.
communities. You had mentioned the wastewater systems and there's PFAS regulations coming down on those. And that was kind of next on the litigation agenda as well. Do you have any information to share? Like kind of.
Yeah, EPA is not regulating it right now. However, PFAS was declared a hazardous substance. So that's going to impact biosolids disposals for sure. In some states are already monitoring, if you will, to get a handle on that. I did talk to a couple of months ago, talked to Andrew Sawyers, who's over that EPA wastewater section there, and he just said it's on the way. Of course, they won't tell you an awful lot, but regulations are on the way for that. So wastewater is part of this what's called multi-district litigation, if you will.
Understood. Okay. Interesting. So more to come. Like
More to come.
keep in touch on that.
Well, actually, I think that I think this, there's been other litigation in the past, such as MTBE back in the 80s. In fact, Paul Napoli was part of that. Um, Asbestos pipe. There's been lawsuits in the past, but this one is a little bit different because all of that, those lawsuits, if you will, the money went primarily to state governments or federal governments and so forth. In this particular lawsuit, the money comes directly to the utility.
Which is huge. It's also harder for them to find the information because they're so used to just dealing with the grants and loans division at their CPHE, TCQ, whoever.
Right.
And so that's I mean that's all they're ever looking at unless they've got a really good specialist. So I talked with Matthew Mendisco and at the town of Hayden, and they hired someone just for stuff like this to go find money for different programs and stuff, and that's like their full-time job at the town. But if you travel to, I mean, even where I live in Genesee Water and Sanitation, there's no one looking at this stuff.
Right.
So
Well, I can't remember the exact percentages, but because I dealt with this for years and years within the DC Beltway, if you will, both legislatively and regulatory. It's like we can't wrap our minds around that a little over 50% of the public water supply systems in our nation serve less than 500 population.
Yep.
To people in that arena, as I'm sure you know, a small system's 100,000 people. But
I agree. No, I completely agree, and that's where we try to target those lesser informed communities because, they don't. I mean, they don't have Carollo and then a person on staff.
Right,
Two
right.
people on staff all looking at this. Yeah, those guys are going to be fine. They've got a whole team, but so this is.
So one other thing pops into my mind, Michael, even if a system does not have, if they've tested and they don't have any detections at all, they still need to register into this litigation because it's sort of like an insurance policy without a premium. And if you're registered into this and you have zero detects, but next year you test and you can file a claim into getting some money out of this. And also, even if you have detects and you get paid X amount of money and the detections increase next year or the year after, you can refile and get additional money. So this is really a good thing for utilities. And that's available as long as these funds last, which we right now we project to be 2030.
Okay, so they'll last 5.5 years.
Yeah, but there's still 12 more companies to settle, so that may be extended out.
So really the only downside is the resources to submit. They're not at risk. I guess that's the biggest thing to demystify or to kind of bring down is there's no downside for them filing it. They're not going to get hit with some fee or they're going to get potentially sued or anything, because I think a lot of people aren't really educated in the court system and the litigation system, and they want to know.
Yes, absolutely not. If there's not a recovery for your utility, there's zero cost whatsoever. I think it is, and I've always advocated, look, this is a positive thing to do. If you receive a question from your uh, customers or whatever, you can say we've taken steps to uh, minimize the financial impact on the ratepayer from this regulation. So I think it's a positive thing to do. I think it's a good thing to do. I mean, I was talking to it was actually a town council of a small community, I think up in the Northeast, and early on, and the mayor was also the fire chief, and had used AAA foam or triple F foam, AFFF. And he started the meeting by saying, we need to discuss this, but I am just dead set against punishing these companies. It saved untold trillions of dollars in infrastructure. It's made our life easier all the way around. I'm just totally against this because he was a fire chief and he'd seen, the use of AFFF foam. And I said, Mr. Mayor, I totally agree with you, but that's not the issue. The issue is EPA is regulating this chemical, and it's going to cost your ratepayers money. So the real question is, do you put that burden on the ratepayer, or do you let these global conglomerates that
Contribute.
manufacture go
Yeah.
contribute to that expense? And he said, well, I never thought of it that way. And of course, they became a client and filed into the litigation. But like I said before, our industry is not a litigious-minded industry. So it's you'd think it'd be an easy sell, but in some cases, it's a hard sell.
Well, I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you so much for coming on today and sharing this. We are going to expedite getting this out and sharing with other communities and stuff. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you.